Hey guys, how's it going? So, they just showed off the Merwin Express, and you're able to headhunt a Moonlight 5 hero. It's basically a selector. Pretty much it seems like you can headhunt once per day, and if you get a dupe character, you're able to re-roll them. Just from doing some daily missions, weekly missions, using energy, just this kind of stuff. So you get points of daily reputation, weekly reputation, using energy, and you're able to use those points headhunting these characters. So you pretty much get to select the ML5 you want, and extra points apparently you can use on Molas and Slates, and I think the Ascension Potions as well. So a lot of really good stuff. So I thought I'd make two lists right here of what I'd recommend people get, at least at the current moment, and my reasonings why, and also talk about kind of the playstyles and where you use these characters. So first, let me start with the newer Player ML5 Tierlist. So these are the characters I would say really benefit newer players the most. Most ML5s are really geared towards endgame PvP. So I'd say RTA is the main use, because even in Guild Wars, there's a lot of ML5s that are useful there, but they're more for RTA than anything else, realistically. So there's a lot of characters that I just don't think are very good for most players. If you're a new person, then this is kind of what I recommend, and I would say most of these you don't really want. Now, something you'll notice is I've already free ML5. These are characters you can get off of the initial Moonlight Selector, but Specter Tenebria I have up here, and you might be wondering why. Reasoning is, there's a lot of people who don't choose Specter Tenebria off of this. They might choose Arbiter Vildred or somebody else that they like, and if they've already locked that character in, then maybe they're still newer on and they want somebody like Specter Tenebria. She is a good character to get. She scales really well into the end game as well and is useful for everybody, so she's definitely a possibility of a character that you could actually go for. I would say that she's one of the strongest Abyss units for PvE, hard, difficult content. And in PvP, she's obviously really useful. She takes a little bit of gear to get going, but it's not really that bad, realistically. So I would say Apocalypse Ravi is one of the best choices. She's a character that's just really hard to kill. Even with kind of whatever gear, she's going to be really tanky, hard to kill, do a good amount of damage, good frontliner. Getting into PvP, she's going to be really useful for newer players, very strong. She's just a really solid, quintessential bruiser, I would say. Almost the definition of bruiser, where she does a bunch of damage, takes a lot of hits, and she's totally fine. And she's usable in any playstyle for a newer player. Endgame, it starts to shift a little bit, but that's kind of how she works overall. ML Lilias. Now, a lot of people might say that she's not worthwhile getting for a newer player because you need high speed gear. Well, as you play Epic 7, you are going to just slowly accrue more speed gear as you start climbing, so you will eventually get faster, but even without really high speed gear, she's just an overall really, really useful unit. She's a huge support for the team. She adds a lot of damage and momentum to the team as well with her S1 spam. Just all around really strong unit. Getting into PvP, she's going to be really useful as just like your best support pretty much. And even in PvE, she actually works pretty well because she's just a very powerful support. She debuffs the opponent, she buffs your team up with damage and defenses, and she has just lots of damage built in with her S1 spam, bringing an ally every single time. ML Kawerik. So the reason he's on here is he's also a really good support, kind of like ML is. He has a lot of defensive ability with his shield. He's great against debuffs because pretty much unless the opponent is debuffing him with multiple turns, silences, or stuns, he always just automatically cleanses and then is able to just buff your team with attack buff, which is great for offensive ability, and immunity, which is going to save you from a lot of heartache of getting stunned and disabled constantly. All around really powerful unit. Another reason why I chose all these units, they all scale well into the end game. I would say these three first ones are the units that scale better into the end game, and Specter Tenebria 100% scales into the end game, but I would say these three are overall considered a little bit stronger than she is, even though she's an amazing unit still, and it's always great for anybody to have this character. Now, let's talk about the decent picks. I really do recommend a really new player to choose the top picks, but we can also talk about some of the other ones as well. And also, let me define newer player. I would say if you're newer to the game, like really, really new, then I would absolutely choose one of these top four. And if you're a player that's been playing for like 3 months or so, maybe up to 6 months or something like that, once you understand a little bit more about the game and kind of how you're playing the game, your play style, what kind of things you need, what kind of holes you need to fill in your team comps and stuff like that, then obviously you can choose a lot more characters. But when you're newer on and you're really limited with gear and a lot of your understanding of PvP and things like that, it can be a bit difficult to choose characters, and that's kind of why I have so many characters that don't pick if new. I wouldn't really choose anyone in meh, and decent picks is even a little spotty, I think, for a lot of newer players as well. So just keep that in mind. Belian. This character is an endgame monster, absolutely amazing in endgame PvP. In early on gameplay, I think they could be a little bit useful for newer people, but overall, I don't really recommend them. The main reason that they're here is just because they scale so well into the end game, and you could probably use them earlier on in some PvP, but I don't really recommend them as a whole, because you can't really get the gear needed for her early on, and she's going to feel a little awkward to use, and she is only PvP, while I would say these characters in the top can also be used in PvE for a lot of newer players. Now, FCC, she was the quintessential tank, one of the best characters in the game for a while. She's not quite the same as she once was. There's other really amazing knights in the game. There's Ross, the main character, who's one of the best knights in the game. He's a 3-star. And now there's Arrowell, a 3-star, who's also an incredibly good knight and very defensive. Sort of like an alternate FCC in some ways. So I don't think she's nearly as required, but she's still a great unit to have. But she's also a PvP-only unit, so she's kind of like Belian, where, you know, they'll be useful once you get into PvP, but can't use them at all in PvE. And I think there's other options, but she's still a nice character to have. Now, Straze. This character is not going to be all that useful when you first start out, because you're not really going to have the gear, but if you put a free attack set on him, he's probably going to have enough attack to really do a huge number on a lot of things. He's a PvP strong unit in aggressive play and cleave, and he does scale into the end game. He kind of scales with his gear as well, so it could be a little difficult to build him for a while adequately for PvP. But he's also really good in PvE, and he's actually used to one-shot hunts and all sorts of stuff like that. And even if just for general like story clear and other things like that, he has a lot of AoE and high damage, so I think he could be pretty useful for newer people if you just throw on that free attack set. Now, I'm not really sure how useful he will be for some of the more challenge content in PvE, but he's definitely usable in really endgame PvE stuff as well. So, Designer Lilibet is the fourth one here, and I'm not 100% sure about putting her here. The only reason she's really here is that she's a cleanser that kind of ignores the rules. She's able to not build any effect resist, kind of like ML Kawerik, and she's able to cleanse for your team, which I just think is kind of a useful thing for a newer player. Now, she's not really useful in PvE, and in PvP, she's a great unit versus aggressive play with debuffs, characters like Ran, obviously, and just cleave and aggro. But in standard play, she's a little bit different and not quite as good. Characters like Belian are good in almost every type of playstyle. Apocalypse Ravi for a newer player is going to be useful in every playstyle, same with Specter Tenebria. So for a newer play, it's a little bit different than really endgame, but I think Designer Lilibet is okay to choose. And here's a couple of honorable mentions, I'll say. Maid Chloe is just a pretty good character for newer people. She's a revive, she has little heals, she's an attack buff and a cleanse. Just kind of works pretty nicely. Sort of like an ML Kawerik that's a little more forgiving just because she has the revive, which could be useful for some people. But I don't really recommend people getting her because even though she's pretty good in the end game actually right now, in the very current meta, I think that she might not scale as hard over time, so it might not be really worthwhile. And let me just quickly say Remnant Violet because he's about to get a huge buff. And I think he already would work pretty solidly for a lot of players, but I think newer people could probably just use him as like a decent DPS, bruiser, single target, high damage character. He has the built-in evasion and stuff like that. They could just throw like a Moonlight Dreamblade on him and he could kind of have some survivability and some good damage. He could be kind of useful, but I don't really recommend him either. The only reason these are higher than these characters is I could reasonably see a new player actually maybe getting some use out of them. But the characters in Don't Pick If New, I would say these characters are largely completely useless for a new player. Most of them either require really high gear or are specifically used versus certain playstyles in RTA or Guild Wars. And I think people just can't really get full use out of them as a new player, and they'll just have to shelve them for an incredibly long time. They might require either really good gear or you just aren't going to be encountering stuff that they're actually good against. As for the Don't Pick At All, these are characters that I would say the characters Don't Pick If New are characters that could be good, but they're just not good for a newer player, and they might scale well into the end game. For instance, DJ Basar is amazing in the end game for RTA. Don't Pick At All, I think that these characters are just bad, and I don't really think that people should choose them at all. And they don't really scale well into the end game. And then we already talked about the already free ML5. So these are the characters I'd really recommend for a super new player. Now, people are going to ask, like, should I choose this one or this one or this one or this one? You should really just choose whatever you like, but what I will say is I think Apocalypse Ravi is probably the easiest to use for the most amount of players, along with Specter Tenebria for easy PvE content. She's definitely the best PvE character on this entire list. As for PvP, I think Apocalypse Ravi will help people a lot and be really easy to utilize. These two supports are obviously amazing as well, but I think she probably is the best bang for your buck if you're just completely clueless about what you want to do, and you just want a strong character that's solid and really consistent. Now, let's talk about the other list. This is the Endgame RTA Tierlist. So you'll notice there's a lot of differences. There's a lot of characters that I said not to choose in the previous list that are pretty high up, actually. So let's talk about all their playstyles and get a little more in depth with that. So, Apocalypse Ravi. This character is hated by many. She's incredibly strong. She is a really powerful character to use in aggressive play or cleave. She's considered something called an anchor, where she basically is such a difficult unit to 1v1 and fight that people draft her in aggro teams and cleave teams, where if the opponent drafts their whole team to countering the cleave or aggressive play, then they still have to deal with the A Ravi, and that can be difficult for them to kill. In standard play is where she's weakest. She can still totally work there, but she's overall definitely way weaker there. I would say that versus DN and Fallen Cecilia and barriers and that kind of stuff, or like a huge protect the carry kind of team, like if your opponent's team is 3 supports and Landy, or 3 supports and Specter Tenebria or something like that, then she's largely useless in that kind of matchup. But she's incredibly strong versus cleave, versus aggro, and in aggro and cleave teams, which is very versatile, and she's an amazing first pick for that reason, because you can pick her and then kind of flex your draft depending on what your opponent decides to do for their playstyle, which is incredibly good. ML Lilias. This character has been pretty much a god since they came out, first picked all the time. She's not quite the exact same level of strength as she once was. She's still obviously one of the top characters in the game. She's an amazing aggro character. She's used in cleave sometimes too. You can even use her in standard. She just does so much for the team. Huge damage, huge defenses, a lot of just aggressive play with her S1 spam, able to disable key units on the opponent's team. She can cycle so fast in the turns that she can actually just straight up make a character like Apocalypse Ravi or Violet or somebody like that get completely locked down at key moments. Is really powerful. She has some weaknesses, like if the opponent is tanked down hard enough with characters like Lionheart Cermia, sometimes they can just punish the fact that she has to dual attack and take your team out. And also, she's not able to cleanse and stuff like that, so if you're taking one of your support slots, sometimes that could leave you a little open to hard debuffs like Senya or something. But obviously, one of the top characters, she requires pretty good gear overall to be really fast, but I've even seen some people build slow but incredibly tanky ML Lilias, which has definitely worked for their playstyle as well. But definitely one of the top picks. She's not the end-all be-all first pick anymore. Things have changed a little bit. People have learned how to tank down a little bit better against her, but she's obviously really good. Belian. This character is used in standard and I would say anti-cleave. The funny part is, though, against cleave, she's almost always banned, so she doesn't really work all that well, ironically. She's one of the best anti-cleave characters in the game, but she's banned constantly when the opponent's cleaving, which is a bit of a shame, right? She's really good versus aggression. She's good versus AoE on the opponent's team. Her Elbrus and counters can just solo an entire team sometimes. If you build her on injury, she can actually fight against stuff like Apocalypse Ravi and health scaling units. She punishes souls, which is an incredibly powerful mechanic. She's a character that will never fall off because her unique mechanic to make it so that the opponent doesn't have souls. You can build her on counter set or injury, and you can utilize her versus basically any aggressive team. If she's on injury, then you can use her in a standard team where you kind of protect her and she can slowly burn down the opponent's team. She's a really good unit for a lot of reasons. I've lost games where I just single attack a few of her allies and she counters every time and you just die and there's nothing you can do. Incredibly frustrating unit, but really useful to have on your side, I would say. ML Kawerik. This guy was a king for a long time after his buff. He's still a good character, obviously, but he's not quite where he once was, where you just pick him literally every single game. He's an amazing cleanser where the opponent debuffs him. He doesn't care unless he's debuffed for multiple turns of stun, silence, anything like that. He just cleanses, buffs your team. You can't underestimate the fact that he cycles so fast his turns, so he's able to constantly push up your team with his S1 while pushing himself up. He's so tanky and hard to kill. His shield is really powerful, not to mention that it also strips the buffs off of an enemy and puts attack down, which is a really big deal. Can sometimes make some DPS units completely useless unless they can cleanse. And obviously his S3 is incredibly powerful. Not really a unit you would regret having because he just makes dealing with debuffs that much easier. Just so good. A really solid unit. Now, DJ Basar is a really weird one. I would say he is one of the pick ban characters in RTA right now. He's one of the best characters to pick, but he doesn't quite have the same power or strength that some of these characters have on their own. He's an incredibly good unit because he's used in aggro and he's used in more like anti-aggro, anti-cleave ways as well. He's a really flexible unit. Let me quickly also say that ML Kawerik is used in more standard play, but he can also be used in some aggro play as well. DJ Basar, on the other hand, is kind of usable in almost everything. I've seen him in cleave, I've seen him in aggro, I've seen him in standard, I've seen him in anti-cleave. Now let's talk about why he's so good. So nobody was really using him all that much. They were like, okay, he's an FCC counter, he's a para counter, cool, that's it. But what made him so big is he's so flexible. If you first pick him, what does he do? He's good against characters that shield, like ML Kawerik or Ross or DN, which are really popular characters. That's kind of a big deal. Also Arrowell, who's become popular recently. He has a cleanse, which is amazing versus teams that like Archdemon Mercedes and Cermia, which became an incredibly popular team. But he also pushes the team up while also cleansing. So he's really useful versus stuff like cleave, because he's like a possible speed contest, and versus aggro. He's really useful in aggro and cleave because you get to push up your team. People run Water's Origin on him, so if he takes a huge hit, for instance something like a Ran S3 or a ML Pavel S2 or something, he pushes up, so people build him fast enough where he just steals the next turn if you hit him too hard with an AoE. So then he just beats a cleave team because he just pushes his whole team and they just anti-cleave, basically just kill the whole other team. So he's just kind of a flexible unit in so many ways. He counters a lot of popular, really big units and kind of shuts them down, like also FCC, he obviously wrecks. But he's also usable in so many playstyles, so he became so popular because you can first pick him, your opponent feels like, oh, I can't pick all these really good units, and then you can kind of choose what playstyle you're going for. Now, he does have some weaknesses. I would say his main weakness is if the opponent goes for a very slow, tanky playstyle with a bunch of heals, characters like Destina. He can't really keep up with that because he just doesn't really do enough in the match. Like, if the opponent doesn't have shields, he doesn't do a lot. He can't cleanse constantly or anything, and his heal is kind of small, so that's kind of his weakness. But he's a very flexible unit, but you really have to know what you're doing with him. And his power seems very hidden until you fully understand it or fully witness what he can really do. Now let's go through these characters a little bit quicker. Specter Tenebria, we already talked about her. She's an amazing ML5, usable in like every playstyle, basically. Standard play, aggro play, even cleave, really. She's really bad versus aggro or cleave if the opponent actually has some AoE, so she can be kind of a bit susceptible to that. If the opponent doesn't have AoE, though, she can work versus a bunch of single target aggression, and she's just a really strong character overall. On Cecilia, we also talked about her. She's still one of the de facto knights versus cleave and aggro because she just gives more mitigation than anyone else could at the very beginning with her big shield, although we're getting that protection set soon that gives the barrier. But just overall solid character versus those playstyles, but I don't think she's 100% required nowadays. And maybe with the protection set on somebody like Eden, you could actually possibly emulate her. Obviously weak to Opsig and DJ Basar, but she's really good if you don't have to worry about those or if the opponent is playing very aggressively. Lionheart Cermia, she's actually shot up in popularity a bit with the release of Arrowell, which really buffs light units, but overall just really good character for standard play. Some people actually will play a playstyle where they make an incredibly tanky one of her, and their whole team is insanely tanky, and it makes it so that at some point you're either going to dual attack or extra attack or something and proc her, and then she's able to almost wipe your team, which is really annoying. All around pretty strong unit though to have for that kind of playstyle. She's really bad versus aggro, really bad versus cleave. If the opponent has enough damage, she can work against aggression if you build an insanely tanky one possibly, but she gets rushed down if you're not careful, so she's very susceptible to that and you have to be careful. Designer Lilibet, we talked about her. She's very good versus cleave and aggro that has debuffs. If the opponent doesn't have debuffs, she's kind of a dead pick. In standard, she has a lot of issues as well. But you have to build her like fast enough that she can actually cut a cleave team. That's one of the most important things. She's obviously really good versus a character like Ran. He puts a ton of debuffs. She takes the next turn. Amazing. But she's not a character that you can just mindlessly draft every single time, and people will draft things like Politis or other stuff to make it so she doesn't push up as much, so it becomes a bit of a back and forth mind game in the draft of like if this character is actually going to be useful versus some of these debuffers. So you definitely have to be careful about that. Now let's talk about Faithless Lidica. So this character actually has become incredibly popular in aggressive play and also cleave recently. This character can be built actually damage, which is really cool, or she can just be built as a support. If she's more supporty, she's used with characters like ML5 to activate him, which is incredibly good, and reset a character, which is obviously really strong. But if you play her DPS, she actually has a good amount of damage that she can help the team with. Sometimes you need that little bit of extra damage as an extra edge versus a team to really eke out that damage you need to kill the important units, and a reset is obviously a big deal there too. I started using her a lot. She's a pick that doesn't really speed contest cleave, so you have to be careful about that, or aggro, really. But she's more of a neutral-ish pick, where you can pick her and kind of be like, well, you know, let's see what the opponent goes for. You could pick her into characters like ML Kawerik, which is obviously great because you just reset him and then he's kind of useless, which is really good. And she can also just strip the buffs off of characters like DN, which is really powerful, while also doing damage if you build her that way. But it is a high gear requirement if you go with DPS Lidica. But I think that she's a very solid character right now for that kind of playstyle. Archdemon Mercedes. This is a standard play character that she's one of the characters you just support. Your whole team is just there to make her work. And she can solo carry. Sometimes the opponent will attack her and they lose the game because she counterattacks and wrecks their entire team. Incredibly frustrating. Really, really good standard, slow playstyle kind of character. Obviously great with Ross and ML Kawerik and those kinds of people. I would say she's really good if you're just playing that slow playstyle because she beats a lot of bruisers. She's not amazing against characters like Shu or characters that don't really care about their passives, but she can beat characters like Apocalypse Ravi, characters like Alencia. She can beat Lionheart if you're able to actually just seal her. Like, just all around really great unit. Even deal with Specter Tenebria because she has the AoE, so she can kind of just take over a match and is really, really powerful. She has a lot of RNG involved, but if you have the right team set up, then normally the RNG isn't that big of a deal, and she'll just be a solid pick. Operator Sigret. This character is mainly for aggro cleave, although I've seen her played in standard, or versus a standard team, I guess, more like in a more standardish comp. She's more aggro cleave. She just hard punishes shields, so she completely destroys characters like Fallen Cecilia and their team. She can wreck characters like Arrowell and their team. People often give her attack buff or whatever, and then she just one-shots anything. She only is used versus barriers, but at the same time, there's enough barrier usage where she actually works, and she actually becomes like a very powerful pick. And barriers have become more popular recently, especially with Arrowell. And with the new protection set, if that actually becomes something that's used, I guess that her usability would go up, but I'm not 100% sure about that one. But she is a really good character. You just have to really know what you're doing and make sure that you can actually set her up enough that she one-shots things. But when you pick her correctly, the opponent almost always has to ban her or scramble to be able to defend against her. Solitaria. I put this unit here, but a lot of people might think that, oh, if the opponent doesn't have a focus unit, she's not that good. And there's not that many focus units, right? If your opponent doesn't really have dedicated cleanse, she can just take over the entire match, and she can also lock down characters like Specter Tenebria, Apocalypse Ravi, stuff like that, which is a really big deal. So let's say your opponent goes for something like DN, and that's their support. Now, DN has a cleanse. You might think, okay, well, she has a cleanse, so Solitaria's not going to work that well. Well, Solitaria every turn is pelting their team with debuffs. Overall, your opponent just can't cleanse all that stuff. They're constantly getting hit by debuffs. They can't cleanse every single turn. Characters are going to get stunned or get a tack down or blind or slow or anything at key moments. So she's pretty much just ramping up your team's amount of turns that they get unhindered while making your opponent's team completely crippled the entire match. Now, if they have dedicated cleanse and they have like 2 cleansers, let's say, she's not going to be that great. And obviously, she's not really that good into like Rowana or Lionheart Cermia, which is a bit of an issue, so you have to pick her later in the draft, but she's a solid unit. Now, what do you use her? You can 100% use her in standard play. You pick her near the end, the opponent usually has to ban her. I've seen her used in aggro as well. Obviously, she's really good counterpick to units like Remnant Violet or Archdemon Mercedes or ML Vivian. But you just don't want to ignore the fact that she actually works versus characters that don't have focus, because she can just completely disable them, just constantly hammer the debuffs. I've had matches where she just keeps stunning their team. Like, even if you stun 1 to 2 units every turn, I mean, that's a huge deal, right? And you're debuffing the rest of them as well. Very big deal, I would say, and she's really annoying and hard to actually kill as well. Okay, more niche. Now let's talk about these units quickly. Some of these characters have been buffed as well. Keep that in mind. And we'll talk about the fact that they're also getting buffed. So Pirate Captain Flan, this character is getting a buff that I would say is relatively sizable. One of the big problems is that she pretty much has to use Summertime Assyria's artifact, the, is it called Pearl the Deep Sea artifact, that puts bombs on her S1. Her buff makes it so that you're able to actually strip a buff and put the bomb on and detonate it, which is really good. She can lock down characters if you have a little bit of effectiveness on her, which is pretty easy to do, especially with the buff that's giving her a ton of effectiveness for free. It makes it so that you can just keep spamming your S1 on a character like Diane and lock them down, keep bombing them over and over. You don't even have to use your S3, really. That's kind of a big deal, I would say. I think she's going to be a pretty useful character in standard play. I don't think she's going to be very useful in aggro or cleave all that much, although you might see her a little bit in aggro. People might try her out. She might be a good counter pick to some units, like maybe Remnant Violet with the bombs and stuff like that. But I think she's going to be a pretty decent character after the changes, but we'll see for sure soon. Maid Chloe, right now, she's really good. For a slow tank down playstyle, she's incredibly strong right now. One of the reasons is because characters like DJ Basar don't affect her because she doesn't put shields. She just simply heals and also buffs the team. She's incredibly strong with Arrowwell as well. Her heals are really useful with that team. Makes it really hard to kill the team that has like Lionheart Cermia, Arrowwell, and Maid Chloe. Really frustrating to fight. Overall, really good unit in those teams. But the reason I don't recommend her as much is because she's gone in and out of usability, and it's possible that she's really good right now, but she'll fall more into the unusable kind of lot in the future, in the possibly near future, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Right now, she's really nice to have, but I'm not sure how long that's going to last. Now, let's talk about Sage. This character versus Cleave is pick ban. He's insane. This character is completely insane. Versus almost anything else, not quite as good. He can work versus aggro for sure, depending on what your opponent picks, but he's the god of anti-cleave. Most opponents' drafts have to rely on either banning him or picking a bunch of stuff around being able to fight him or kill him before he gets a turn, or just like somehow hard disable him. Once he gets a turn, the match is over usually for a cleave team, and he's just constantly creeping up. He limits the amount of turns the cleave team can actually take before they actually deal with you. Usually cause the opponent to have to either hard disable you immediately or immediately kill him, or somehow push their team up enough that they don't care. You build resist on him and some tankiness, put like Proof of Valor, and the opponent is just like, okay, I have to nuke this guy instantly if I can't just like Lua reset him or Peyra restrict him or something. So if you need a godlike anti-cleave character, he's your man, but otherwise I wouldn't really choose him. But he's just amazing versus that one playstyle. Remnant Violet. So a lot of characters don't, or a lot of people don't think that this guy is good. He saw a good amount of play, I would say, in high-level RTA near the end of the season. He's really good versus characters like Belian and Alencia, and he's good versus characters that just don't straight up counter him, pretty much, right? Like, he can actually fight Apocalypse Ravi just fine. Like, I've had plenty of matches where he's one of my only DPS versus Apocalypse Ravi, and the Apoc Ravi can't afford to just S1 him every turn. They'll lose. He's incredibly hard to deal with for some people. Obviously, his weaknesses like Archdemon or high aggression or cleave, he'll usually just get blown up. But if we're talking about standard, he's a pretty solid unit. He fights toe-to-toe a lot of really popular units. I've fought tons of Shu with him, tons of Alencia with him. You can fight against stuff like, you know, obviously Carrot and Belian, and just any DPS that doesn't straight up counter him he can beat, right? Now, obviously, you can get unlucky, but he's overall a pretty consistent character as long as you draft him right and you have the right support for him. It's also really fun, and his buffs are about to make him, I think, really strong, even though he still has a lot of the same counters, and you can't just pick him in every single match, obviously, right? You have to be strategic how you're using him. You can't just draft him into Angel of Light and Archdemon and Solitaria, right? Even though he has all these weaknesses, he still comes back like a cockroach. He's always a pickable unit, it feels like. You run him on lifesteal and a slower playstyle, and he just works so well. You can even make him really fast and high damage if you want, but I think he's better on the slow lifesteal. And the buffs are going to make him way more consistent, a lot more proactive, makes it so you can actually use a good soul burn on him to get the extra turns, and make it so when you get the max bar, he just automatically S3s, which makes him a way bigger threat to people where they can't just ignore him as much until eventually they have to hit him and he activates an S3. Now he's a constant threat of possibly activating his S3. Closer Charles, he's used in aggro and cleave where he's incredibly good. Let me also talk about top model Luluca with this. She's getting buffed basically to be like Closer Charles. They're both characters that push your team, attack buff your team, and do a bunch of damage. The difference is he does an AoE, and it's a non-attack skill. She uses a non-attack skill, which can be punished by like Politis and, you know, Belian or stuff like that. But she does an AoE, so she doesn't get countered like Closer Charles would. So they work in a lot of similar ways, but they have little key differences. She's a little bit faster than Closer Charles is, but only by like 2 speed. She does a huge single target nuke, and she turns invisible. He gets evasion. One of the big things I would say is she can hold Book, which is incredibly useful for a cleave team. Book is really powerful, obviously. Or you could just go for a damage artifact. As for Closer Charles, this guy, he has his passive where he gets to push up, so you could do a huge damage nuke to somebody, and then he pushes up, even if he's slower, which is really helpful. And he's also able to S3, and then sometimes get pushed up and almost just get the next turn, which can be really big. While top model Luluca can't quite do that. I'd say they're both very similar. Closer Charles is tried and true, just a pretty solid unit, and he's good. And we'll see how top model Luluca is, but they're both just really good aggro cleave characters, I would say. Straze, he's become more popular recently with his buff, but he was kind of the same as before. Like, honestly, the buff didn't change much, except make him a little more popular because people realized he's still good. Really good in aggro and cleave. Just completely wrecks teams that rely on, like, a big frontline tank where you just kill them and then you just kill all of their squishier units right after. He also gets the invulnerability, so he can get an extra turn, so he's usable in more aggro teams than just cleave. I've used him a lot. Obviously, he can be speed contested, so you have to be careful about that, and he's susceptible to just being one-shot, so you can't just draft him, like, instantly at the beginning. Normally, once you kind of secure the first turn, you draft him. ML Vivian. This character has been used a little bit more recently. I think she's a flexible character, good in aggro, or good in more standard play, because she's a little bit hard to kill. You can run her on lifesteal, or you could run her on speed set with Book. The thing that I think is going to really help her is Chatty, the artifact that you can get for free from the side story for like either pay Skystones or use one of those free ticket things you have, is about to get buffed, and it's going to be really good on her in standard play. She's going to start with a massive shield. Also, she's really good with Arrowell, who's become popular, and I think she's just a solid character for being able to survive a lot of bursty characters, and I think Chatty is going to help her being used even more. So that's why she's kind of up here. Now, all the characters in here are more niche, like you can't just pick them non-stop, and they're more for specific playstyles or countering specific playstyles, but I think all these characters are good. I think ML Vivian definitely deserves to be in here, and I think we're going to see her more often with the fact that Arrowell got buffed, or not, the Arrowell came out, and the fact that Chatty is getting buffed. So I think she's going to become a little bit more popular. Now, let me just say, the characters in Meh, it doesn't mean that they're literally useless, but they've seen a huge downturn. You don't really see these characters all that often. Little Queen Charlotte is way harder to draft. She gets punished by so many things right now. She can totally work, but if the opponent has like ML Kawerik and you don't have a cleanse, she just gets disabled. Hard debuffs wreck her. She can just get disabled too easily and requires a lot of support. ML Celine is countered by like a million things, same as Remnant Violet, but she just dies to even things that don't straight up counter her sometimes. She can just die to a bunch of non-crits from like tanks or just stuns or anything like that. It feels too easy to beat her. Arbiter Vildred can be good versus some cleave or possibly aggro, but as a whole, he's really seen a downturn in play. Really hard to utilize. People have gone so tanky, so he just doesn't really hit the same as he once did. And he just has way more counters than he once did. Even if you use him versus cleave, sometimes Sid could just kill him and 2 hits, right? Just S3 into S1 and then he's gone, right? Kind of a big problem. Last Rider Crow, I see him every once in a while, but it's pretty rare. You could use him versus like Archdemon teams and Solitaria and stuff like that, but that's kind of it. He's seen very little play overall, and people are kind of looking for him to get a buff, although I'm a little scared because he could become insanely good because he once was a god. Same with Ambitious Tywin, see him way less. Kind of hard to utilize in RTA nowadays. Along with Last Rider Crow was once a complete god. Both of them together were amazing characters, but you don't really see them all that much anymore, and they're just not easy to use in a normal team. Ruel's kind of the same. The meta is so aggressive and fast that you can't really use her all that often. She's for a much slower playstyle, for a much slower game, pretty much, and since the game is so much accelerated from the old days, you don't really see her all that often. Further playstyles, I mean, she can be used in like Cleave or something, or aggro possibly, even standard, but kind of hard to use. She can be used in an aggressive playstyle or standard. If you have a push, she can be used aggressively. He was basically for either anti-cleave or cleave, but you don't really see him in cleave anymore. Last Rider Crow is for more standard, Ambitious Tywin is for more standard, and Ruel is for standard. Don't pick. I think these characters are just bad right now, pretty much. Dark Corvus is only for Guild War. ML Ken is just not really all that usable nowadays. Too many counters. Silverblade Araminta gets wrecked by almost every cleanser in the game right now, and it's kind of just hard to utilize. As soon as you set her up in a team, the opponent probably has already picked cleanses to deal with the characters that set her up, so she's too hard to use. Specimen Says is fun with Airwell, but he's kind of more of a meme unit. He's really fun, but I wouldn't say he's all that great. Judge Kisei is just a worse Lua in almost every single conceivable way. She needs a huge change, honestly. She's just not good. Barwitch Asari, you could pick her as a last pick to cause a force ban in some situations. Overall, just not really that great. I mean, I guess she works versus Remnant Violet, but just not really that strong, kind of needs a buff to really come back into the public eye. And Blood Moon Haste, I would say he probably needs a buff. I don't think he's really that good. He's good versus Revive, but just not really good versus anything else. I'm actually going to be choosing him because he's one of the only ML5s I'm missing, and I kind of like him. And I think he's going to get buffed at some point. So that's who I'm choosing. But overall, what I would say for Endgame RTA, these are kind of the top picks. These are characters that are just sort of staple characters that almost everyone wants to have and are incredibly powerful. The very strong picks right here are characters that, you know, you can't pick them in every single game, but they're really good at what they do, and you see them very often in many games. They're really, really popular nowadays. The characters in more niche, some of them are also very popular, but they're for a very specific playstyle or usage. You can't just use them willy-nilly in every single kind of team of your playstyle, right? So you have to be a little bit more careful in using them, and often require better gear and a little more strategy to utilize than the characters just in very strong. And meh, I wouldn't really go for, and please don't pick those units. Unless you really like them. So anyways, I think that was a pretty comprehensive breakdown on all of the characters that I would choose and why or why not, and their playstyles. Tell me what you guys think though in the comments. I hope that this actually helped, and I appreciate you watching the video. If you enjoyed it, then don't forget to like it or subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you guys next time.